After 3 days, we left Stratford, Florida, and travelled north. We knew we'd be welcome at other monasteries, because they were always open to people in need. Earlier, we had passed Llandewi Brefi, where a mound had risen up while St. David was preaching. It was a case of making a mountain out of a molehill. Now we were heading further north, trying to persuade people to go on the Crusades. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the Saracens believed they would go to heaven if they died fighting Crusaders. And the Crusaders were told they would go to heaven if they died fighting Saracens. Heaven was going to be very crowded. Do you think God would punish someone for making a noise at mealtime or falling asleep in the middle of Mass? I don't think so. I hope not anyway. I wouldn't want to give birth to a cow. When we got to North Wales, the roads became steeper and steeper and steeper. The weather wasn't too good either. Gerald said it was curious that the nightingale never visited Wales. Baldwin said it was a clever move on the part of the nightingale. This was his one joke of the whole journey. Baldwin thought that the bad weather would be good training for the Crusades. It must have been the wrong sort of training, because Baldwin died in Palestine, outside the gates of Acre. At Nefyn, we found shelter for the night. The houses are made of wattle, twigs and mud. They were only built to last a couple of years. Ordinary people led simple lives in those days. They didn't have much furniture. Gerald said in this part of the world, the air blew straight from Ireland. The air was so poor that nobody died of anything other than old age. In Anglesey, Gerald persuaded many of the common people to take the cross. But sometimes their clothes are so threadbare that the cross came straight off again. And it was in Anglesey that we found a stone which would return to the same place, however far away you took it. To test it, they chained it to a large boulder and cast it far out to sea. And sure enough, the stone returned to the place it had come from. It was also said that if any couple fondled each other near the stone, great drops of sweat would drip from it. Compared with most of Wales, Anglesey was very fertile. Gerald remarked that the Welsh ploughed a field by pulling the plough backwards. This had its dangers. In those days, medicine was very primitive. Their equipment, well, it wasn't very sophisticated, and sometimes the cures were worse than the complaint. For an eye wound, the treatment was a burn between the eyebrow and the back of the neck. And for swellings, the best thing was to put a plucked cockerel on the wound. For head wounds, it was best to open up the skull and apply herbs. But the general cure for most ailments was to have your blood drawn and sucked by a leech. Of course, it wasn't everyone who could afford a doctor. Most people had to rely on holy relics like St. Ceirig's staff. If you paid a penny, it would cure you of all sorts of things. Gerald said that if you cheated and only paid half a penny, you'd only be half cured. After we left Anglesey, we crossed the Conway and went to Rhuddlan Castle. Wales was a divided nation. The princely families were always fighting each other and marrying each other. But Gerald thought little of women. He said that a woman's hair was a snare for the feeble-minded. Welsh women wore their hair short. Not far from Rhuddlan was a spring. People said that it ebbed and flowed with the tide. Strange what you find, isn't it? Of course, in those days, people were very superstitious. They'd believe anything. People believed that there were 32 days in the year that were dangerous. One of them was the 16th of September. Another was the 26th of July. And people also believed you could tell the weather by examining a ram's shoulder. If you were a bit more scientific, you would go and see a soothsayer. There were plenty of them in Wales. People thought that soothsayers were possessed by devils. When you asked them something, they immediately lost control of their senses, and words would stream out of their mouths. Usually, you couldn't understand what they were saying, and then the only way to stop them was to shake them very hard. And so, we rode back to Hereford, and our journey around Wales came to an end. Sometimes, I think Gerald, well, I think he hadn't enjoyed it very much. Some of the things he wrote about the Welsh in his book were not very nice. He said they didn't keep their promises, and that they lived off plunder. And that they were sunk in a deep abyss of every vice, perjury, theft, and adultery. But then, Gerald didn't have very nice things to say about the Normans either, or the Anglo-Saxons. He complained that the Norman kings abused the church. I think Thomas à Becket would have agreed with him. He was Archbishop of Canterbury until Henry II had him bumped off. And he said the Germans and Anglo-Saxons were disdainful and cold. Well, because of the frozen polar regions that lay adjacent to them. The important thing was that our journey had been a success. 3,000 people had taken the cross. But not all of them went to the Crusades. Some people paid to be released from their vow. And some of those who had sworn they would not turn back until they reached Jerusalem turned back before they got to Palestine. Gerald didn't go to the Crusades. He stayed at home and wrote books. He gave 6 of his books to the Pope. He was told that the Pope kept them beside his bed. Gerald started to write the story of his life. It is going to be 200 chapters long. He died in 1223. 181 chapters too early. Nobody knows the end, only me.
Keep the road